What does it mean to be a professional baker? Is it the same thing as being an artisan baker? We call ourselves Proof Artisan Bread, and it's absolutely beyond any doubt true that we produce artisan bread, whatever that word means today. The deepest expression of that meaning in a modern world. Our bread is derived of flour that we're often milling ourselves from grain that we've grown in our local backyard. We use only a natural sourdough starter to leaven our doughs, connecting back to 13,000 years of tradition, refusing the convenience of speed that comes with commercial yeast in favor of all of the natural benefits and historical traditions surrounding sourdough leavening. That being said, we as a business exist in the modern world. We have the same financial constraints that any other business. We have to pay for the spaces that we occupy. We have to procure ingredients to make what we make. We have to invest in the labor force that makes our products, paying wages that allow people to sustain themselves, while also leaving enough resources for the company to be able to move forward. Recently, I've been reflecting on the sobering reality that we exist in a really narrow band of success, meaning the difference between success and failure for Proof as a whole is a very thin line of things that can go wrong. You could fail at Proof, making exceptional products that people love and return for in growing number by not being mindful of all of the aspects of being a professional in what you do. I first started Proof because I wanted to do something meaningful with my hands for my local community. And I should back up. I didn't start Proof. I took a new idea that had been fostered and developed for, I think, 2.5 to 3 years over. Something that was still in its very infant stages. Something that was still mostly rooted in creative self-expression. Because at the time, it wasn't an economically viable thing to do in order to support even oneself. In other words, the original Proof didn't have enough of a financial return for my family to thrive off financially in what we needed to pay for our home, our bills, our regular expenses of life. And Proof remained in that state for some time. Even after Amanda and I took over, we started with working at our regular day jobs. I remember in the early days, I would be mixing bread by hand while also managing the original hand-me-down ovens that we possessed in our garage, and also having a earbud in attending a conference call for my previous line of work. And for the first 6 months, Proof was supported primarily off of my old income as well as Amanda's old income. Amanda actually didn't leave her day job for about a year. And so for the first year, she was putting in investment into Proof from her other source of earnings in the form of the labor, which is our most expensive investment. Currently, we find ourselves in a difficult place. Proof has grown to multiple locations, and we have many new people learning alongside us in picking up this craft, or even in operating a retail artisan bakery. There aren't a whole lot of seasoned, experienced veterans in what we do in our area, meaning we don't have a stockpile of applicants for jobs that have consistently made 1,000 loaves of naturally leavened bread in a day, or many thousands of naturally leavened pastries in a week for a group of their own stores and market events. In fact, most of the people applying find themselves in positions similar to where I was when I took over Proof. That is, they're doing something totally different, some of which might be able to play into their role at Proof, but they're inspired by the idea of working on something with their hands in the local community with deep meaning, both from a cultural and even skill craft-based perspective. It's amazing to have a crew of passionate people. I think in that way, Proof has something that many businesses would love. You often see it when you, as a customer, go into a place and realize that there's not a whole lot of energy in the room. You realize people are going through the motions, wishing the day would be over so they could return to their lives outside of work, behaving with that sort of sentiment in how they even convey themselves in the workplace. We don't have that problem on the whole at Proof. Sometimes we find that there's a misalignment between somebody's love of what we do and our love of what we do. But oftentimes those situations work themselves out somewhat quickly. Most of our staff come in wanting to be here, just like I wanted to be here in the beginning. But perhaps the imagery that they have upon entry doesn't paint the whole picture of what it requires, what is required of them to be successful. In fact, I know it doesn't, because over the years, we've gone through this cycle of people joining, being super excited about the work that we're doing, stoked to learn something new each day with their hands, feeding off of sort of the dopamine response of doing something tangible that yields this physical return of a feeling of satisfaction, a feeling of gaining a new skill, a feeling of novelty as you're exploring a terrain that you haven't really explored before. But none of those early stages come with the efficiency, required for success. As a food-based business, our margins are very thin. I'm sure that these numbers look different depending on where you are in the world. After all, maybe in Germany, energy costs are relatively higher than the energy costs in the US, but perhaps flour is more accessible and less expensive relative to the resources that you have to operate with. And so the prices, the stresses maybe lie in different places. Perhaps energy would be a bigger stressor than our utility bill is at Proof. And flour would be less of an issue to fit in financially. Maybe labor wouldn't be as big of a deal in certain parts of the world where minimum wage is lower for a company to bear and make all the finances work. Where we are, the investment in people is typically where a business either makes it or breaks it. And the challenge that we have is that we have this desire to make amazing bread and amazing pastries with our hands, doing something meaningful in the community. And yet, the entire structure of our business exists next to all of the other types of bakeries that there are, namely the industrial ones that have machines fulfilling all the work start to finish in an automated form, outputting thousands of times more than we can output for the same relative cost due to their operating scale. And where perhaps they have the ability to sell their product at a lower price, our price can only exceed their price by whatever amount the market will bear, meaning however amount of people we can convince that it's worth buying our more authentically and intentionally produced sourdough bread than our competitors' industrially produced white bread. Well, that tolerance level isn't that high it's not thousands of times more, of course. Maybe the average person buying a loaf of bread will spend a few more dollars on our really amazing, authentic sourdough derived of freshly milled flour grown locally, made by skilled artisans, than the industrial white bread in the grocery store. But it's not going to be more than a few dollars difference, that tolerance range. So the percentage is just nominally higher. Yet our true cost of production is significantly more. We, first of all, start from this very humble set of roots, meaning in the beginning we were funded as a company just purely by Amanda and I being willing to work other jobs and fund our initial activities in the bakery. We had one financial asset. Amanda owned a condo that we sold about a year into owning Proof. It was her first home, and since that point, we had actually moved into a home together where Proof resided, and we were actively renting out that condo. Well, we also didn't have enough money to pay for the things that we needed to keep Proof going in those early days. We already had a few staff members. We were buying new equipment. We were trying to set ourselves up in order to build a proper bakery, and our incomes weren't enough. Not to mention, it was very taxing to work fully in something else and put your all into a startup. At some point, we had to dive all the way in. And when we did, we sold a condo. And we were very lucky. We had about $100,000 of equity to use, which funded Proof for basically the entire year of 2018. We're able to buy a proper oven, actually the oven that we still use in our Shea Bakery today, the one that we originally installed in the garage. It was a big turning point for us as a business to have that oven. We were also able to afford around 4 team members in terms of their wages for helping us out for that year, meaning our shortfall on labor was about the remainder there, $80,000. Had we run the year without selling the condo, we would have lost $80,000 because that was how much less we earned as a bakery versus what our actual liabilities were in paying our staff. So that was our beginnings, and we've grown into what we are today under the same dynamic of having to produce bread, make the sale, collect the revenue, pay all of our bills, and progress ourselves forwards step by step with whatever remains. Well, in really reflecting on that whatever remains, it's hard to stay in healthy territory. Even as you grow, you would think that we've already learned a bunch of lessons. We already know how to do things a good enough way to get to this point, but we're constantly evolving ourselves out of our realm of expertise. See, in the garage, the percentage of work that Amanda and I were doing on the front lines, that is actually making the product, was high. Nowadays, because we have multiple locations to manage, the percentage of output that's coming from my hands is relatively low, as well as Amanda's. Well, the problem being now that there's always new people coming into the organization learning, and now we're reliant on them to continue the tradition of moving at a certain level of efficiency in order for the numbers to work. I want to cite an example that happened somewhat recently. You see, Amanda and I were spending our time forging the future. That is, we're scanning for opportunities and evaluating them. We are also operating the company. We're thinking about getting everybody paid, setting everybody's benefits up, figuring out how to make sure that all of our liabilities are paid, sourcing ingredients, building systems that organize our work so that the team members that we have know how much dough to mix tomorrow or the next day. Training our leaders to manage the individual facilities, and many more activities that come when you're wearing the owner's hat. Most of those activities happen behind the scenes, and as a result, only a percentage of our time is now devoted to being able to be on the floors of our bakeries with our teams making dough. And when we're not in one place, we're at it. When we are in one place, we're not in another. So because of that, when we're not in another, it can become like the game of telephone, where something that we know and did just gets subtly evolved over time to a point that it's not recognizable. Almost always for good intention, but enough to destabilize the relatively narrow band of success that we operate within. So here's a really interesting example. We recently had a very skilled manager who was introducing new staff members to processes at one of our bakeries. And we have a pretty established way of refreshing our sourdough starters. At Proof, we refresh our sourdough starters in two main ways. The way that we've been doing from the earliest days of our garage journey, that is in buckets by hand, and then the other way, which is in our sourdough starter tank when we're trying to produce a huge amount for the next day. The by hand refreshes are always present. Both of our bakeries do by hand refreshes every morning. The way that it typically works is somebody takes a bucket, fills it with water, then puts the right amount of starter, typically half the weight in water, and also the right amount of flour, which is typically the same weight of the water, and by hand stirs the mixture together for roughly 1 minute until incorporated. It's relatively easy to scale that process to as many as, say, 8 to 10 buckets. Once you get past 10 buckets, a tank starts to make more sense. But let's say you're doing 4 buckets of refreshes and they're all the same. We typically do 10 kilograms per bucket. You put the 4 liters of water, 4 liters of water, 4 liters of water, 4 liters of water, 4 liters of water for each of the buckets. We even have water meters in our mixing stations that dispense the right temperature and the right amount of water with the tap of a button. So you can set it for 4 liters. You can set the temperature you want and go 4, 4, 4, 4. Something somewhat similar is done with the starter. You put the buckets on a scale and go 2 kilos of starter, 2 kilos of starter, 2 kilos of starter, 2 kilos of starter. And something, once again, similar with flour. On the scale, you go 4, 4, 4, and 4. To fill the ingredients for those 4 buckets typically takes less than 5 minutes. And then about a minute of mixing per bucket, being able to go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Our sinks have sprayers on them. All of them do, something we've invested in since the garage, so that when you're done mixing your last bucket, you can go to the sprayer and in about 10 seconds spray off any excess starter that's on your arm and move on with your day. That is how we've been refreshing for years. Well, we hired somebody, and that person was training other people to do refreshes. And it turned out that our tables are somewhat tall in one of our bakeries. So when you put a scale on the table and then you put buckets on that scale, if you have somebody that's a little bit shorter working, now that bucket is way up tall. And so this motion of stirring is really uncomfortable and inefficient. Well, had I been in the room when this situation happened, I would have said, okay, we have a bunch of items that we can use to lower the entire setup. We have some carts that sit lower than the tables that can take the scale and can take the buckets. We even have dollies that sit even lower, which do accommodate scales, and so one can work at a lower level and accomplish the same thing with the same efficiency without changing the base process. Well, our relatively new but experienced manager had a different valid creative solution, and that was to use a mixer to do the bucket refreshes. So that is, they dispensed the full amount of water, then the full amount of sourdough starter and the full amount of flour into the mixer, mixed it all together, then emptied or scaled out starter into individual buckets, and then cleaned the mixing bowl. Well, the other day I noticed that this process was now the new norm. Actually, everybody was learning to do by hand refreshes in a mixer. And one of the subsequent learners ended up taking about an hour and a half to perform 4 bucket refreshes. Well, looking at it from a business perspective, that one process, which should have taken no more than 20 minutes to complete with setup and cleanup, having taken 4.5 times as long, meant that it has an inflationary consequence to our cost structures, which exist in sort of a fragile window. You see, I mapped this out the other day to sort of come to speed with where we are today, and realized that if our labor costs much exceed 40% versus the amount of sales that we're bringing in, we start to struggle to pay all of our bills. Below 40%, things get easier and easier with each percentage drop financially for us in our business. These numbers could change depending on where you are and what your other costs are. But for us in our business, 40% seems to be this really important benchmark. Well, let's say that my by hand refreshes and those types of practices that I used to do myself in the garage, paid out to other staff, would bring us to 35% cost. And take the example of the sourdough starter refresh, which now, because of a process change to accommodate a shorter staff member, now that process is 4.5 times as long. Well, if you do that in many places across the production process, 35% labor can balloon in a hurry. This is the kind of thing that we've been observing lately in our spaces. And it seems to be related to how our staff views their work, meaning people are leaving some other form of work and finding refuge in the groundedness that the bakery provides, the tangible aspects of working with dough that are all around you at Proof. And I believe that that sort of a perspective shapes how they view the idea of being an artisan baker. But in reality, to be an artisan baker and to sustain yourself as an artisan baker, you still exist in the overall world economy. And if you don't work with a certain level of efficiency, you won't be able to afford to do what you do, because you can only move the pricing so much. And at the end of the day, you still have to pay for all of the aspects of what you do, the building within which you reside, the tools which you use, the ingredients that go into your products, and the big elephant in the room, and that's the time that everybody is spending to do the work of making the bread. So this is meant to be a strong message to those people that are trying to be professional bakers, that we have to modify our view of the artisan baker from something that is overly romantic to something that is more realistic in the modern world. That's to say that the professional artisan baker has to work at a pace and efficiency in order to earn the right to exist alongside all of the super automated forms of bread that are cheaper and more efficient to produce. And the artisan baker has to earn the right to pay for all of their bills. And no matter how much great quality bread or how many customers you reach, the work has to remain efficient. Otherwise, the whole thing can fall apart in a hurry when the baseline work multiplies in complexity to accommodate and then sort of telephones into something different. It's a challenging place for me to exist in and even connect with my teams over, because at the foundation, there seems to be a win-loss relationship, meaning I earn more money hourly the more hours I work, but that represents a cost to who's employing me, and they end up losing when I work more. But if I work less, they end up winning financially. That it's an easy takeaway from this dynamic that actually I need my staff to work faster so that I can have more. But that's a misguided way of looking at it, because if anyone were to just try to make bread for themselves, sell it, and make a return, they would be confronted with the same dilemma that you have to do the work with a certain level of efficiency in order to, from say, whatever price your loaf is, have any percent left over at the end to be able to pay for a bill or to pay for your own income, let's say. So I believe that we ought to challenge ourselves to be professionals in what we do, and professionalism comes with the understanding of, if I exist as a professional baker, whether I'm an owner or an employee, my job is meant to make sure that the bakery as a whole can sustain itself and thrive and keep making new products for people in a month or 2 months or 3 months. And thus, I can make the most beautiful bread, but if I don't do it efficiently, if the cost of my employment becomes untenable in the small margins that a bakery exists within, well, then it doesn't really matter how beautiful the bread is, because the bakery itself won't be able to sustain itself long term with that kind of continuation. And so I think it's important that everyone who works in this space approaches it as a journey within which they get better and better and better at. We often go through these busy moments in the year where it's merited for some of the more experienced managers or leaders at Proof to get involved at the ground level and make products alongside our team. These are awesome moments because we get to work shoulder to shoulder and influence things and notice things and see where certain processes have gone awry. Well, I was reflecting on the idea that oftentimes our team is looking for concrete black and white standards. This is how we do things. And building those standards is harder than meets the eye, because in our sort of tribal knowledge of doing these things since the garage days, we have learned to adapt to many different situations that call for nuanced, slightly variable approaches. And teaching this can be really challenging. Let's say I were to put together a production manual for how to make our sourdough croissants. I would likely say, well, first you mix and then you bulk ferment and then you laminate and then you roll out. And when you get to rolling out, you roll the laminated dough through the sheeter to the appropriate thickness, then place it on a table, and then you trace the lines that you're going to cut the dough out. You cut the dough out, and then you roll up the croissants. Well, that is the correct step-by-step process for making croissant dough. However, when you get a group of people together around tables making more than one sheet of croissant dough, the rules can change in terms of how do you affect the best end result given the team that you have in the moment. I think that oftentimes our team members are thinking about their own skill building along the way. Well, I'm excited to learn the sheeter. I haven't done that before. But I'm thinking about, well, we have this amount of bread that we're producing and we're expecting this amount in sales, and I need to reserve this percentage to pay my staff. And so I'm evaluating what's the most effective way to get the work done in a moment. Meaning, yes, I want to teach that new staff member how to use the sheeter, but depending on how the day is running, I might wish to have a more experienced staff member run the sheeter more effectively. Similarly, once the dough has left the sheeter and is on the table, if I have a group of people around the table at different skill levels, I may work with what I see in a different rhythm. I'll give you an example. In recent memory, we had a day where our senior management team went into one of our bakeries and made more plain croissants that were later going to be turned into a twice-baked croissant special. We were already fully scheduled for the week, meaning none of our team members had the capacity to make this extra batch. So it was a group of senior management. And amongst that group, there was a variety of skill. Amanda and I and Logan were in the group, and all of us are pretty fast, amongst the fastest in the company at shaping croissants. But we have a few members of our senior management team that graduated to managing or leading and haven't spent years and years and years making croissants, maybe hardly more than a month or two in those stations. Well, we could have done the following. We could have had maybe myself and another senior leader with less experience, each working on independent sheets of croissant dough. That is, I trace mine, he traces his, I cut mine, he cuts his, I roll up mine, he rolls up his. But there's a very different level of skill between the two of us. And so his sheet of croissants will roll up at less than half the pace, and potentially with twice or 4 times the risk in mistakes than my sheet will. And yet we could push his skill and get to the best possible outcome of our combination by making some changes. So instead, we put 2 sheets of dough out together, side by side, and I traced the lines for both. I went from one sheet right to the other, and it only took seconds to trace the other sheet. Then I started cutting out the triangles of the croissants. And guess what? I just went from one sheet to the next because I'm pretty fast and accurate at cutting. And if you cut wrong, well, you can ruin the whole substantial portion of the sheet. And the speed at which I can cut allowed my less experienced teammate to focus on just rolling up croissants. But I also was able to roll up croissants the moment I was done cutting. And I was able to roll up more than my sheet. I did my sheet plus some of his sheet because I'm naturally faster due to having more experience. But as a result, he was working so closely shoulder to shoulder with me that he learned how to more optimally work with 2 people at disparate skill levels. But he also was sort of pushed to work with a little bit more speed because I was kind of closing in on his space. It's kind of a gentle pressure that actually makes people stronger, that kind of idea of pressure builds diamonds. Well, as a result, we completed our work that day rolling out 12 sheets of croissant dough with a person on the sheeter, Logan, and then 3 people on the table, myself, Amanda, and this less experienced senior leader in 45 minutes. Whereas it's been taking our regular teams upwards of 3 hours to do the same work because you don't have that kind of collaboration between sheets with the variation in skills currently built into the rhythm. Everybody's trying to do everything start to finish like from a formula, and yet it's important to read the room. So in this case, it was important for me to see my teammate is pretty good at rolling up croissants, and that task is hard to get wrong, and he's helpful to me even if he's slower than me. By rolling up some of the croissants, we're going to get done faster. But the moment that my teammate is doing some of the extra, more technical things that I can do faster, well, the risk of cutting the dough wrong or the speed at which the person will cut the dough will significantly slow down the end result. So what I'm hoping to convey is the importance of viewing every moment in the bakery as, well, kind of a contest or a competition, in the sense that we have to meet the moment with the best possible performance that we can give in that moment, because our performance today impacts the longevity and sustainability of everything that we're working on. And even if you find yourself in a role somewhere in a bakery where you're not the owner, I would hope that even if baking is something that you're doing for a season or 2 seasons, that you would want to leave a legacy behind when you move on to some other work, knowing that you were part of that really cool thing that still exists, that you can talk about to your future coworkers or friends or family. Yeah, when I was younger, I was a part of that bakery, and they're still making some of the best bread around. Well, the thing is, in order for that to happen for a bakery, we have to exist within that very thin set of margins. In our case at Proof, it means keeping our labor rates at something under 40% to the sales that we're bringing in. So I'm struggling in bridging this kind of knowledge gap within our teams. But I'm hoping that by talking more about it and bringing this conversation to the surface, I can sort of instill this need to sort of view professionalism as efficiency and quality put together for the sake of sustainability.
It's easiest to score your loaves when they're cold.
We eat with our eyes first.
You have to understand your audience enough to be able to say, like, I'm going to be charging a lot of money for my super crazy cool thing, or it's so cool and so creative that only you can do it, and then you don't stand a chance of scaling it.
Let's go over what it's like to build a bakery from one person to many.